Hello, everyone. My name's Tom Bennett, and I'd like to talk to you today about high challenge behaviour. This is a very common feature of many teachers and head teachers' lives, and it's something that lots of people who are child-facing have to face. So, over the next 25 minutes or so, I want to run through some of the basic techniques, much more than tips, but strategies that competent professionals use in high challenge environments to deal with high challenge behavior. You're not alone. This is something that many people face. So, first of all, there's a basic paradigm here, which is that if you want to tackle high challenge behavior, it might sound counterintuitive, but the way in which you tackle high challenge behavior isn't always reactively, although, of course, it often will be. But a lot of the time, what it's going to be is you're going to be trying to create a culture round about the student and students that makes high challenge behavior less likely, if that makes sense. And the way in which we do that is by having a very proactive approach to behavior, which is what I call the behavior curriculum, this idea of teaching the behavior that children need to see in order to flourish and in order to understand how to behave. This means lots of taught norms, lots of taught routines, and also lots of support to help children understand what these routines are and how to achieve them. And in a classroom environment, you'll also have broad whole school, or you should have broad whole school, whole classroom systems in place to respond to behavior. So a reactive approach. And this could broadly be called consequences. And consequences can be lots of things. It can be reminders, it can be cautions, it can be redirection, it can be distraction, it can be cautions and warnings, it can be mild penalties, it can be congratulations, encouragement, or support. There's lots of ways in which we can react and respond to behavior. And if you have a systematic approach to that, it's much more likely the students will realize what will happen to them if they do misbehave in a high challenge way. So essentially, you create your classroom culture by having a strong whole class or whole school system of routines. And all staff need to be trained in these routines. Everyone has to know what they are. It can't be left to their own devices, and it can't be something which is done on an ad hoc and entirely individual basis. You want to have systems in place. And incidentally, if you're running a school, what the glue that joins us all together is accountability. Somebody needs to be checking that people are actually doing all of this. These are the behavior basics. And I say basics, but they are hard to do. And often when you're incredibly busy or you face high challenge, they might not seem particularly obvious. But this is what highly competent child-facing practitioners tend to do in general. So oddly enough, if you want to tackle high challenge behavior, the most effective way to do it is to create an environment where high challenge behavior is less likely. Now, that doesn't tell you how to cope with it when it happens, but it is absolutely essential for us to understand before we move on. You cannot talk about responding to high challenge behavior by itself. It's part of a holistic package. So the theory of change that I've just painted is that if you have these approaches, you'll have strong norms which will discourage escalation, i.e., high challenge behavior will be less frequent and possibly less severe. And in a situation like that, if you do have a student who is persistently repeating their behaviors in a high challenge way, or high tariff pupils, you might say, you offer them lots and lots of support. So there are obviously going to be things like sanctions and boundaries and penalties for breaking rules and so on. And they might have to be exited. They may have to be suspended. There might have to be lots and lots of high ticket responses. But there should also be support packages and pastoral packages, conversations with the students, short-term, medium-term, and long-term approaches that try to help the student understand their behaviour, to get past their inappropriate habits, and to develop better habits. And in some schools, for example, there might even be inclusion unit work. There might be a space within the school where students can have that kind of work done with them in a mainstream environment. Even in a non-mainstream environment, you might find that students who are probably already receiving higher staff ratios and more targeted training, there might be spaces within non-mainstream environments where there's an even more targeted area where students receive one-to-one work and so on. So when it comes to behaviour management, there are normally two approaches to trying to deal with it reactively: structural and interpersonal. Structural means the systems that the school has. This might be the systems which are in place, which the school puts into their behaviour policy. For example, if a student walks out of a lesson, this happens. If a student is rude to a teacher, this happens, and so on. And the structural approach to behaviour management is essential. You have to have that skeleton. But so too are the interpersonal behaviour management systems. That's when we manage behaviour or misbehaviour using our personal skills, relational skills, and understanding how to speak to people who, for example, are in high states of agitation or are gripped by emotions. An example of this would be, for example, de-escalation of conflict. So things like that are useful. But of course, at a much more blunt way of describing it would be that you need to have these skills for low-level interactions too, not just for crisis situations, but whenever you speak to a student. So interpersonal skills matter, but they particularly matter when it comes to dealing with an antagonistic, aggressive, upset, or deeply distressed child. You need to have both, and the best school environments I've seen have both of these things. Broadly speaking, we could say there are 4 stages of behaviour intervention. You can respond and intervene before it happens, which I've kind of outlined already. This idea that you create an environment where misbehaviour is less likely. We could quite easily call that prevention. You know, it's great to have a fire service that can put out fires, but it's much better if fires don't catch in the first place. The next stage would be diffusing. That's when the high level or high challenge misbehaviour is just starting to begin. You know, 2 students start to shout at one another and so on. And you might call that diffusing. You know, what can you do then? And then once something which is distressing or highly emotional or displaying high levels of violence and so on, or intensity happens, you might say this then becomes de-escalation when the event is occurring. What do you do when you see a fight? But then there's a 4th stage, which is often missed in school environments, which is resolution. Once the high challenge behaviour has, broadly speaking, blown itself out, what do you do next? You know, what do you do immediately afterwards, and what do you do in the short to medium term afterwards? One of the key things to remember about this is that the earlier you intervene, the more effective your intervention probably will be. And that the earlier you intervene, the less energy you'll have to expend in creating the resolution that you're looking for. So I've talked a lot about proactivity and making sure you create an environment where misbehaviour doesn't occur. But even with these cues, even with these norms in that culture, you'll still get misbehaviour, even in the best and most nurturing environments. What teachers must learn to do when situations start to occur is perform what I might call reactive cueing. You respond to misbehaviour at the very earliest point and try to cue what the right behaviour is. You remind the students, this is what you need to be doing. And also point out, this is starting to go wrong. Here's what I would like you to do instead. None of this is magic. It doesn't make things, it doesn't solve all problems, but it helps. It helps a great deal. You could say to a student, for example, you know, if you carry on like this, then I'll have to keep you behind at the end of the day, or something as simple as that. But the point is that you try to intervene, you offer some level of challenge. You give the student an off-ramp so that they understand, I need to change my behaviour now. This won't work with all students, but it works with some. And I'll take some over none. So this gives the students the chance to change their course without losing status. So if you've given them a reason to stop misbehaving, then they may take the opportunity. I'm using the language of choice. You know, you can carry on as you are, or you can stay behind at the end of the day. It's up to you. You can remind students what they should be doing. You can distract them by saying, do you want some help? And little things like that. And sometimes that deflection, that distraction can be very powerful. There's a general principle here. Small fires are easier to put out than large fires. Now, there's also something that I call the invisible ladder of consequences. The formal ladder of consequences, or the visible ladder of consequences, is the school behaviour system. And in some schools, that might be C1, C2, C3, or it might be moving seats and so on. It might be a warning, it might be a name on the board and so on. There's normally a school system which then applies with formal sanctions and consequences and so on. And that's important. But as I mentioned before, relational approaches are also very important. I call this the invisible ladder of consequences. This is when you use interpersonal nudges and cues and reminders, and voice and tone and eye contact and proximity in order to show the student they need to change their behaviour and you would like them to do it. And this avoids necessarily having to always use the formal ladder of consequences, although I have to stress they are very important and you must use them. Use both, in other words. So the invisible ladder of consequences is when you see a misbehaviour start to occur, you intervene as low-key as possible. It might be eye contact, it might be proximity, it might be, you know, touching the desk or something like that. And then as you find that they do or don't respond, you can then escalate the intensity of your interpersonal pushback. So, for example, you might want to say to them something like, you know, I need everyone to have eyes on me. William, I need eyes on me. William, I need you to get eyes on me, otherwise I'll need to speak to you later, or something along those lines. Keep your vocabulary simple. If somebody's starting to lose their temper, if somebody's starting to kick off, fight, swear, shout, or something like that, you need to keep your vocabulary simple. Now is not the time for long, complex discussions. When somebody is upset, they are not thinking as clearly as they normally would be, and all of their cognitive biases start to emerge. So if things start to kick off, you have to acknowledge that you're not in a rational conversational space anymore, that you have to act. And that part of that action will obviously be speech, but if you do have speech, it has to be simple. Give people take-up time, give them a few seconds to respond, because if you're upset, then it's very possible that your biases start to come into play and you start to expect instantaneous compliance and so on. Sometimes that's necessary. For example, if they're going to set fire to the curtains, but sometimes do they need to have a few seconds to think, right, I need to change my course here. Describe really clearly and really simply what you need them to do, and try to use conditional language, which lets them feel like I've got something to do with this. You know, I can be part of this conversation too. Like, put the chair down and we can talk. That type of thing. When you see behavior which is highly challenging, like for example, a fight, the first thing you have to ask yourself, just take a second and ask, am I the right person here? Take a breath. Don't just fire in immediately unless you have to for reasons of safety. But by and large, it's usually much, much better if you have a quick look and think, right, who's really the person I need to be dealing with here? Because I've seen fights where, you know, the victim has been treated as the aggressor by somebody jumping in too quickly. Am I the right person? Do I summon help? The answer is almost always yes, summon help. And what do I want to do here? Make your objective clear. Do I want the student to be taken away somewhere safe? Do I want to remove them from the environment? Do I want them to get them back into a classroom or whatever? Normally, the answer is if they're in a high challenge behavior situation, they probably need to leave the classroom. It is very unlikely they'd be able to remain in the classroom because they're upset. And when people are upset, they're not thinking clearly and straight. Try not to wade in too quickly. Take a breath. And before you do so, look for danger cues, because your own safety matters too. And you have to notice to see if a child is potentially in a violent state where sometimes they may not be thinking rationally, where sometimes they might not even be worried about your safety or indeed their own safety. So try to think about all these things at once. When somebody's upset, when you're facing high levels of challenge, stay calm. Use a low, consistent voice. And sometimes you can really surprise students by saying things like, I'm here to help you. Let's see how we can make this better. I can see you're upset. You know, let's go away somewhere and fix this. Language like that can be very, very useful because they're probably expecting you to be an antagonist. Ask them what's happening. You know, as Winston Churchill famously didn't say, jaw is better than war. If you can get them talking, it's better than whatever it is that they're doing in the first place. And be clear about what they need to do. Make it simple. You need to come with me. You need to come with me. I'm here to help you, but you need to come with me. Demonstrate empathy, control your own emotions, and be aware of your own body language. Don't look like you're going to get involved in the fight too, unless you have to, because of course, physical intervention, well, the last resort, obviously, is sometimes necessary in order to, for example, restrain a violent student. But speaking of that, safety first. Can you handle it? Should you intervene? That's nothing I can decide for you. There has to be a judgment made in that moment. And nobody should ever feel like they're forced to intervene in a situation where they are in danger. But there's also a balance to be struck, which is that we also have a duty of care towards children. And many parents would take a dim view if we didn't intervene in order to help and save and protect their children from aggressors. Which is why sometimes it's best to get other people involved, because of course 2 or 3 people can do things like restraint and removal much more safely than one person. So summon help if you can, but don't intervene if you think your own safety is at risk, unless it's extremely extenuating circumstances, like for example, an endangered child. Try to get the student away from the audience. I wouldn't take the audience away themselves. I would take the student away, and I don't think it's useful to get the whole class to leave a classroom. That's not fair on them. It's the student who's acting aggressively that needs to be removed. And ask your class not to jeer or encourage them. When you're talking to a student, particularly when they're upset, show active listening. Look at them, nod. Maybe repeat back some of the things they've said to show that you've heard what they've said. Use open questions so they can answer you the way they want to answer you. Don't get right up in their face. Stand at a non-threatening distance and treat them with dignity. Always treat a child with dignity, no matter what, even if they've done something wrong. which is frequently the case. But treat them with dignity, because the objective here isn't to win. It's not to make them realise I'm a terrible person. The objective is to get them to calm down, get them safe, to get other people safe, and to create an environment which is calm and sociable, and then to deal with the outcome and the consequences of the action. Things like sanctions and penalties and tellings off and reprimands, all that can come later. Right now, the objective is get them away from potential victims and the potential audience, get them away, get them safe, get everyone safe, get learning happening for other people, and get them somewhere where they can calm down. When somebody's upset, it takes about 40 minutes for them to calm down. Their body is flooded with adrenaline. It's a physical chemical. It needs to take time to subside. And when the gale subsides, well, everybody eventually calms down. It takes effort to stay angry. Happy people, they get sad again. Sad people, they cheer up. Angry people calm down. There's a kind of a happy balance. There's a regression to the mean, which everybody experiences. It takes effort to be in a highly agitated emotional state. So give them some time. It might be you just have to passively supervise them for a little while. Then you can have a rational conversation. And when you have that conversation, this is really important. Be honest about what you need to do next. Be honest about what's going to happen, who's going to come in, who they're going to speak to next. Are they suspended? Do they have to go home? Is somebody going to collect them? What are the consequences of their action? You need to be honest about this. You can be kind about it, but you must be honest about it. And when you ask them to do something, you use clear sequence directions. Give them something easy to understand. Try always to be positive. Say things like, I'm here to help you. Let's see if we can fix this. Let's see if we can see a way out of this. But that doesn't mean avoiding them taking personal responsibility. But it might be that when they're upset and angry and aggressive and in an agitated state, that might not be the time for a conversation where you're asking them to take responsibility for their actions. That conversation probably needs to happen when they're calm and they've had a little bit of distance from the event and they're not consumed with the emotions and being in the moment. So be assertive with them, but don't be aggressive with them, but do not be submissive with them either. Use a calm voice. Have few people there as possible. Don't have this conversation in the middle of a hallway or a corridor or somebody outside the assembly. Don't have this conversation in a place with half a dozen other members of staff. It's embarrassing. So have it somewhere where they can feel they've got a little bit of dignity. And it might be, for example, that one of the things you can do to get used to these types of conversation is to script these types of conversation. This is something that you can do for yourself, or you can work with other people, or leaders can do for staff. Script what the types of things that you would like people to say in challenging moments like this. The right thing to say, like, I'm here to help you, or let's see if we can fix this. And these are great phrases to use with somebody who's agitated and upset. So teach your staff or teach yourself the scripts you would say, and also the physical scripts of what you will do. So teach your staff what to do if there's a violent situation in the classroom. Teach them what the process is, so they know that they don't have to rely on making something up on the spot. So they know that they can lean back on a prepared physical script of what they should be doing. So if somebody starts kicking off in a classroom, you summon help, you ask the student to wait outside, you might issue a warning, you make sure the student is exited from the classroom, and so on. The point is, there should be a prepared, predictable reaction to even a chaotic situation like that, particularly if it's a student who habitually behaves like this. And also, incidentally, when that response is scripted and predictable, it's actually better for the student as well, because they know what's going to happen to them, which actually reduces the chance of them doing it because they're more deterred. And when they do behave like that, they realize what's happening to them. They're less upset about it, and so on. So restorative conversations are an interesting thing, because I frequently hear people talking about restorative conversations as if they are a panacea, as if we can use them in every circumstance. We cannot. They are very useful in some circumstances, but restorative processes tend to be best used when there's a relationship to restore. For example, if two people had a fight but they're good friends, apart from the fact that they're hitting each other, and you're trying to restore that relationship between them. So that's sometimes a useful thing to have. It's much less useful to use instead of penalties. And my solid advice would be that we shouldn't replace sanctions and penalties with restorative processes. That's not what they're for, and they're not very effective at that. You need to have both, in other words. But to my mind, the best way to use restorative processes is once a student has received some kind of penalty, once they've been suspended, once they've done a detention, once they've lost their privilege or a golden time, or even if you just had to reprimand them in the corridor outside, then you have a kind of, I call it a threshold conversation, really. It's a conversation where you remind the student, this is what went wrong, this is your responsibility, this is what you could have done, this is what you should have done, but also I care about you and I want you back in the lessons and I want you to do better, and here's how to do it, but here's what's going to happen if you can't do this. That type of conversation, I call that a threshold conversation. It helps to reset the narrative, and the child understands, here's what I should have done in the first place. And it helps them to take responsibility, and it avoids them thinking, everyone hates me, the school's picking on me. So whenever you're dealing with a child with high challenge behavior, use powerful communication, specific directions, be concrete, don't be abstract, don't be vague. Put yourself in their shoes a little bit. What are they hearing when you're speaking? And if you're talking about something complicated and ambiguous and abstract, they're not going to be hearing that. When you're using communication to children of any shape or form, but particularly when they're agitated, always assume they don't understand you. Make sure you've repeated it. Check they've understood you. Sometimes you may have to repeat yourself a couple of times so that they do understand you. And finally, parents and carers, well, they play a part in this too. Obviously, when a student is kicking off in a classroom or a corridor, parents are usually not available at that point. But one of the things that we can do is to realize that parents are often our greatest allies in this endeavor, and that parents, for the vast majority of them, love their children far more than we ever possibly could. So it makes absolute sense to work with parents and to ask for their help, to get involved in working with us to work with children, particularly with high challenge and recidivist behavior. So build an emotional bank account with them. Make sure they're aware of what the school processes are. Make sure they know what a child has to do in order to be removed or exited or suspended or detained or whatever. Make sure they understand this. And make sure they know what they can do to help and support the school. Make sure that the parents also can tell you things about the students' behaviour and maybe their triggers and things that upset them, so that we can be aware of that and work accordingly, sometimes perhaps making exceptional accommodations and so on. When you work with students, when you work with parents, when you work with anybody involved in the human sphere, find common values and build on them. And the common value that parents and schools have in common is the well-being, the flourishing, the success of the student. And when you're dealing with parents, and parents will be a really important part of dealing with children who exhibit high challenge behavior, never bring your emotions to the conversation unless they're positive ones. Don't be angry, don't be upset, don't be disappointed. Don't make the parents feel like they've been bad parents, because they're probably struggling or doing their very best in the circumstances that they face. So let's try to work together with these people. And thank you for listening. Working with high challenge behavior is never easy, but I'm not here to tell you it's easy. I'm here to tell you that it's important that we make the effort. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you very much for what you do.